All right, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dave Finger. I'm the Chief of Legislative Affairs for the National Volunteer Fire Council. Thank you for participating in this webinar. I'm going to spend probably about 45-50 minutes talking about conducting meetings with congressional offices. Everybody's on mute. As I go through the presentation, if you have questions, you can either type a message to me or you can click on the little hand icon, at which point I can unmute you if you've called in and you can ask a question that way. I will pause at the end of the presentation if there are questions, but don't hesitate if you have something as I'm going through to just let me know, and I'm happy to pause and address those as I go along. So with that, we are holding this in advance of the NVFC's spring board meeting, which will be April 19th through 21 in Alexandria, Virginia. We're holding it in conjunction with the CFSI dinner on April 19th. A number of NVFC board members will be in town for that. We also typically have a significant group of different state association members and just individual NVFC members who come to town for our meeting, for the CFSI dinner, and many of those folks go up on the Hill. So what we want to do this year, and it's a little bit different than what we've done in the past, is have a webinar here for anybody who's interested in going up on the Hill, having meetings, to talk a little bit about the mechanics of how that works. How to conduct meetings, how to set meetings, what to expect. I'll be doing a second webinar closer to the board meeting where we'll talk about the specific issues that we are going to be encouraging folks to raise. I'm not going to get into as much detail about that on this webinar because it's more focused on the mechanics of having meetings. I guess first thing is first, we'll talk about how to set meetings. This would be a good time to start thinking about setting meetings. Probably want to do it at least a month out, but having a couple months in advance is always good. Most offices are going to have a form on their website, and they prefer that you use that rather than calling or emailing. So the first step, I think, would be to go to the website for the offices that you want to talk to and see if they've got a form, and if they do, go ahead and fill it out. If they don't have a form, you can call. If you do call, you would ask to speak with the scheduler, or you can email. And if you send an email, I would recommend putting meeting request in the subject line. That way, whoever gets it will know what it's about and can forward it to the right person. For those of you who have done this before, gone up on the Hill and developed some contacts, if you know somebody in an office, particularly somebody you've met with before, following up with them directly is also good. So, you know, if you've already made that personal connection, that's also a good way to go. This website, and there's others that work, but this is one that I use sometimes. If you aren't sure who your representative is, or you don't know all of the representatives in your state, you can go to www.contactingthecongress.org. You can also just go to Google and say, you know, congressional delegation, and then the name of your state, and typically it'll bring up something. And that'll not only tell you who is there, but give you links to their website. When you are contacting an office to set a meeting, whether you're using a web form or calling or emailing, I would recommend identifying yourself first as a constituent, where you are from, then as a representative of your fire department, then as a representative of your state association, if that's relevant, and then as a representative of the NVFC, and in that priority order. First and foremost, these offices are going to care about you as a constituent, then as a local firefighter, and on down. You want to be clear about who you are and who you represent because it's going to impact who you end up meeting with. Also, if you are scheduling a meeting on behalf of a group, you want to make that clear. If there are 10 people from a congressional district or state coming to a meeting, your chances of getting in to see the representative or the senator go up compared to if there's just one or two. So you want to include all of that information right up front when you're trying to schedule a meeting, because it's going to impact who you get to meet with. You also want to provide some amount of information about what you want to talk about. Again, you don't need to go into too much detail about all of that, but, for instance, I want to talk about Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program, Volunteer Recruitment and Retention, U.S. Fire Administration, just general topics, and you can follow up later on with the more specific topics. So also with setting meetings, so who should you target? This is more relevant the larger your state, right? So if you're from New York and you've got 30-some odd representatives, then you're going to have to probably be selective about who you decide to meet with. If you're from Wyoming and you have one representative and two senators, then you meet with all of those folks. But if you're in a larger state and you have multiple representatives, the first people you want to meet with are the people who represent you. So your U.S. representative and your two senators. Those are the main offices that you definitely want to make sure that you get in to see. If you're voting for the person, they ought to care about what you think, and so make sure that you get in to see them or somebody on their staff. Now, another thing to be aware of is committee assignments. So let's say, you may not be in their district, but somebody in your state is on the Homeland Security Committee, or is on the Tax Rating Committee, or is on the Agriculture Committee. Those are committees that oversee programs, oversee policies that have an impact on volunteer recruitment and retention, volunteer grants, fire service grants. So those are things to be aware of. If you're from Texas, for instance, Representative McCall in Texas is the chair of the Homeland Security Committee. That might be an office that you want to target even if you're not in his district. You can also meet with committee staff. There's two different types of staff that you might interact with on the Hill. One is personal office staff, and that's kind of the most common group that you're going to meet with. But committees have their own staff. If you're going up on the Hill and you'd like to meet with committee staff, let's say you're from Utah, Orrin Hatch is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and there's a tax bill you want to talk about. You might be able to get in to see committee staff. I would actually recommend, if you are interested in that, to follow up with me directly. And if you don't know how to get a hold of me, my contact information is on the last slide here. NVFC board members obviously will know. But, and I'm happy to help facilitate that. Okay. Another group that you might want to target would be new congressional offices. So if we're in the second year now, so freshmen have already been in for a year, but typically newly elected officials are still kind of trying to figure out their district, figure out their constituent base, don't necessarily know the issues as well as somebody who's been in office for a long time, and they're often looking for issues to champion. So one of the things that I would recommend doing is, looking at your state delegation and seeing, okay, who just got elected recently, and then trying to make it a point to get in to see that office, particularly if they represent, a district that is more rural, that's going to have more volunteers, that might, they might be more likely to champion some of our issues. Last piece on who to target, I say make the most of your time. I know some states will do big delegation meetings, right, where they'll have, like I know Pennsylvania, for instance, often does a breakfast, and they get all of their members of Congress to come and sit in the meeting, and they talk about a couple different issues. I know New York, I believe, typically goes from office to office with a big group of firefighters, and they talk about a group of issues. Think about what your options are. If you're part of a big group, think about how you can be most effective. Is there one issue? Are there two issues that you really want to make sure that you have an opportunity to raise? Are you going to be able to talk to somebody on staff with your U.S. representative and your U.S. senators? It may be worth following up with those offices ahead of time and saying, hey, I hope you're going to be able to come to this breakfast, and by the way, I'd love to chat for 5 or 10 minutes offline. Or if if the representative's not going to be there, if you give me the name of the staff person who's going to be there, because you really want to have that personal interaction, that one-on-one time. So there's different strategies for how to do that. If you're in a smaller group, if you're the only one going to meetings, obviously that's less important. But I know with some of these, the states, you've got a coalition that goes out and does the meetings, and it can be kind of difficult to navigate. So just think about, following up separately with some of these offices and seeing if there's a way to have some personal one-on-one interaction. Okay, so your meetings are set, are planned. Here are some things to consider in terms of how to be a good advocate. And this applies, I think, whether you're talking to a member of Congress or an elected official or just anybody that you're meeting with. So the first thing, and this would be specifically for representatives, U.S. representatives, is to know the district. If you're meeting in a U.S. representative's office, they almost certainly have a map on the wall that shows a geographic outline of the district. Take a minute or two to look at that map and think about what you know about the district, the fire service in the district, anybody you know in the district, the characteristics of the district, and if possible, try to work that into the conversation somehow. At the very least, be aware of who you're talking to and what's the biggest city in the district. Do they have any critical infrastructure? Are there national forests in the district? All these sorts of things, because that's probably going to impact how they view the issues that you're raising. Have an agenda and prioritize your message points. So you're going to have limited time, and I would recommend hitting the most important things first and then working your way down, just to make sure that you definitely get to those things that you feel are the most important. Keep your message simple and concise. Don't get into the weeds. I would assume that the people you're meeting with have a limited attention span and a limited amount of knowledge about what you want to talk about. Let them surprise you. Sometimes they'll know a lot more and they'll be a lot more interested than you think, but don't spend so much time on an issue that you lose them and then they've just sort of tuned out, because that happens sometimes. It happens to me sometimes when I'm doing meetings. Provide specific anecdotes or data to support your message. So this is kind of your hook. This is what they're going to remember about the meeting, an hour from now, a day from now, a week from now. You're going in to try to get them to support you. In order for them to support you, you sort of need to turn them into an advocate for you. So what can you give them that they can use to, advocate for you when they're talking to another member of Congress or a staffer in a different office? Anecdotes and data are very quick and easy ways to illustrate a point, more so than, again, getting into the weeds and explaining every intricate detail of the issue. When you don't know the answer to a question, admit it and promise to look into it and get back to people. This gets at your credibility as an expert. If you give someone bad information, they're not going to trust you and may just tune you out going forward. It's sort of expected that as people ask more and more questions, at some point you may reach a point where you're not going to be able to answer them. There's nothing wrong with taking a note and saying, look, I'm going to have to get back to you, and By the way, it also gives you a great excuse to follow up later, which helps you build a relationship, which really is kind of the long-term goal for a lot of these meetings. Be a good listener, even if a legislator disagrees with you. So you're trying to educate them, you're trying to find common ground. It is unlikely you're going to meet with a single office that will do every single thing that you ask them to do, right? Nobody's going to support you all down the line on everything. So if they don't understand the issue, explain it. But at some point, if they're just not seeing the point or they disagree with you, move on and try to find an area where you do have common ground. I typically say if you can get everybody you meet with to agree with you on 2/3 of the issues, by the end of the day, you're probably going to have enough support to get most stuff passed. You don't need everybody to agree with you on everything. Know what you are asking for before you go into the meeting, and don't move on to a new issue before making your ask. The ask is the most important part of the meeting. What do you want them to do? Do you want them to introduce or co-sponsor a bill? Do you want them to co-sign a letter? Do you want them to call leadership and ask leadership to do something? If you don't ask them to do something specific, they will smile and nod at you and say nice things about the programs you're talking about, but they probably won't do anything different than if you had never gone in and talked to them in the first place. So you have to be very clear about what you're asking for, and then you need to wait for follow-up. Now, typically they'll say, oh, that's interesting, I'll look into it and get back to you, and that's fine. Just make a note of it, and then they'll get back to you. But don't let them off the hook by just kind of acting as though they support you without putting them on the spot. Take notes, and that enables follow-up on questions or commitments that come up. I mean, this is pretty standard. It may seem at the time like you're going to remember everything from the meeting, but I can tell you after a day of meetings, they're going to blur together, and you're going to forget who said what and who committed to what. So take pretty careful notes as you're going through. And then at the end of the meeting, summarize key points in a positive manner. So this is a way to circle back if there's any misunderstanding about what was discussed, if there's any misunderstanding about what you asked for, this is an opportunity to kind of revisit that. And do it in a positive manner. At the end of the day, you want everybody to come away from the meeting feeling like, hey, we're on the same team. We have, we support each other, right? They're hopefully supporting our issues. We're hopefully, supporting them to the extent that we can. And we want it to be a positive interaction. And that gets into, hopefully down the line you can develop relationships with people. And you have an opportunity at the end to kind of circle back and make sure everybody kind of sees the meeting in retrospect the same way. Okay, so those are some advocacy tips. Now, in terms of how to conduct a meeting up on the Hill, my first recommendation would be to do formal introductions. So you're going to go into the office, you're going to talk to the representative, senator. Hey, how are you? I'm Dave with the Greenbelt Volunteer Fire Department. Everybody's going to shake hands, maybe give out some cards. But then when you sit down and the meeting starts, I recommend go around the room and everybody gives a formal introduction. So your name, what fire department you're with, how long you've been in the fire service. If you're an NVFC director, you could reference that. Obviously, the more people in the meeting, the shorter you probably are going to make your introduction, but it's a good way to let everybody in the room kind of know where everybody is coming from. And then get your story straight. Again, the more people in the meeting, the more important this is. If I'm in a group meeting, I feel most comfortable if there's one person kind of moderating. That would be somebody who can kind of ride herd on the meeting, keep an eye on the clock, move topics along, bridge from one person's talking point to another. It's real easy when you get into these meetings, if you haven't kind of plotted it out ahead of time, for everybody to sort of fall on top of each other talking about things, and it's not what you want because it's going to waste time and it can actually lead to confusion. Know who's going to raise which issue. If everybody wants to talk about the Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program, that's fine, but we don't need 4 different people telling a story about apparatus. If everybody wants to talk about AFG, you got to kind of figure out who's got which anecdote, who's got which data points, and how to blend those conversations together. If everybody wants to talk about a different bill, that's great, but you want to make sure that you know what issues people are going to be raising. Not everybody has to be 100% supportive of every bill that comes up, but you ideally don't want somebody in the group to be talking about a bill or an issue that somebody else in the group hates or disagrees with. So if you've got a big group, if it's a diverse group, spend a little time beforehand to kind of figure out, okay, who's bringing up what and how can you raise this so we're all kind of on the same page. Keep an eye on the clock and don't get bogged down. I go up on the Hill a lot, and I have a lot of meetings, and I have found, for myself personally, the more that I talk, often the less persuasive I become. I would much rather communicate 80 or 90% of the information in 30 seconds than take an extra 1 or 2 minutes to communicate all of it, because after that first 30 seconds, if they aren't engaged with me, they probably aren't really listening anymore. So again, front load your information, do your best to communicate, and then hopefully have a conversation. So you can have a 5 or 10 minute conversation about a particular issue if the person across from you is asking questions, if they're engaged, if they're making points and soliciting your feedback. It's really like talking to anyone, right? If they look interested, if they're asking you questions, then it's a conversation. It's fun to some degree. If they're just kind of sitting there nodding and looking bored, then you're probably not making a big impact, and it's probably time to move on. Okay, so just want to talk a little bit about who you may be meeting with. Obviously, the goal is to meet with your elected official, either the representative or the senator. If you get in to see them, great, but oftentimes you won't, and even if you are, they'll typically have 1 or more staff people who are also in the meeting. One category, you may meet with a high-level staff person. This is going to be a chief of staff or legislative director. Typically, at the beginning of meetings, folks are going to hand out their cards so you can kind of see who the person is. A chief of staff or legislative director is kind of a stand-in for the elected official. They typically know the elected official personally and professionally very well. They know the policy positions of the elected official. They know the process for how new policy positions are established. They're involved in establishing those positions. They know the politics. So they can typically speak fairly well for that elected official because they're really embedded with that person and helping make policy for them. They may not be as well versed on the subject matter. They may know, the chief of staff or legislative director is going to have responsibility for every single policy issue that comes before the office. So hopefully they have a little bit of knowledge, but they may not actually know as much as a mid-level staffer. So a mid-level staffer is probably going to be a legislative assistant or maybe a legislative fellow. These are the folks who are really the subject matter experts. They're going to be the ones who chase down any rabbit holes, talk to other congressional offices, talk to the Congressional Research Service to get all of the different angles on a particular policy issue, and then they're going to write a memo, and that's going to go up to the legislative director, chief of staff, and the elected representative. So they're more likely to be subject matter experts than people higher above them. On the other hand, while they're going to understand the positions and the politics and the process, they're usually a little outside of the loop in terms of actual decision making. Okay, so there's a bit of a trade-off there in terms of if you're talking to an LA versus an LD. And then the last group are low-level staffers, and this would be like a legislative correspondent who's mainly doing constituent work, responding to constituent calls and letters, and then a staff assistant who's kind of like an office manager. So the low-level staffers are sort of your up-and-comers. Staff turnover on the Hill is pretty rapid. People go from being a low-level staffer, you might be a staff assistant, then a legislative correspondent the next year you might be an LA, the next year you might be an LD. So people move up pretty rapidly, and how they kind of start on that ladder is they start to take policy meetings. So as you can imagine, the low-level staffer is not going to be as knowledgeable probably about the policy. They're going to be completely outside of the loop on the decision-making process, but they're probably going to be a lot more motivated than somebody further up the chain would be. They're probably going to present themselves as though they know a lot more than they actually do. They may be as nervous about taking meetings as somebody going in to meet with them might be because they don't have that full grasp. But it's probably easier to establish a relationship with these people and have an email back and forth with them after the meeting, simply because, to them, dealing with you may be a really big deal because it's, you're a constituent, you've got a policy presence, you're a firefighter, you're involved with the NVFC, and, they may be looking for issues that they can really work on and champion. So there's, frankly, advantages and disadvantages to whoever you're meeting with, but those are some of the things to keep in mind when you look at that card and you see, okay, this person is whatever position, and have a little bit of background to think about for when you go into the room. Okay, so I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on the issues, but I did want to give a little bit of an overview of some of the things that I am anticipating we will probably end up advocating for in April. We just spent the last year lobbying on reauthorizing the AFG and the SAFER grant programs. That was signed into law January 3rd. So the good news is that the programs are extended through 2023, but we still need to appropriate funds for them on an annual basis. Congress still hasn't passed FY 2018 appropriations. Hopefully by the time you're here in April, they will have completed that and have transitioned on to FY 2019. But at any rate, wherever they are in the process, we will be developing a one-pager and encouraging people to talk about funding for the AFG and the SAFER grant programs. Volunteer Responder Incentive Protection Act, this exempts the first $600 per year that a volunteer receives in recruitment and retention incentives, exempts it from being subject to income tax, withholding, reporting. That's active legislation. We may actually see some movement on that between now and then, but this will be another bill that we'll be advocating for. Volunteer Emergency Services Recruitment and Retention Act. For those on the NVFC board, this is what we typically refer to as the LoSAP bill. There were two pieces of this. The first piece was doubling the annual cap on LoSAP contributions. We actually got that included in the tax reform bill that Congress passed last year. The second piece is making it possible for LoSAP plan sponsors to make contributions into LoSAP portable. And that's a bill that hasn't been introduced, but will probably be introduced in March, and we'll have a one-pager on that for when you go up to the Hill. U.S. Fire Administration appropriations, again, along with AFG and SAFER, trying to increase funding for USFA, which has been flat-funded really for the past decade. That'll be something we'll be advocating for. Volunteer Fire Assistance Program. This is a grant administered through the U.S. Forest Service, helps mostly in all volunteer fire departments that protect communities with populations of 10,000 or less. we've been able to get some funding increases for that recently. We are hoping to be able to get funding restored to the level of $16 million either this year or next year, but in any case, there will be a one-pager on that. And the Firefighter Cancer Registry Act would set up a national registry for firefighter health, and it would link then to existing state cancer registries, and the idea would be to give us much better information, give researchers much better information on why firefighter cancer is caused, and hopefully give us a better idea of how it can be prevented. So those are the main issues we're probably going to be talking about. There may be some others that come up between now and then. One that we're working on hard right now that I'm hoping will be resolved by then is extending the add-on payments through Medicare for ambulance transport reimbursement. Those expired January 1st. It looks like Congress is probably going to act on that next month, but you never know. And so that may be something else that gets added to the list. If anybody has any issues beyond this that I just mentioned that you would like to talk about in your meetings, you're obviously welcome to. You're welcome to follow up with me personally, and I can, if it's something the NVFC has a position on, I can develop a one-pager. As long as we support it, I can develop a one-pager. So just let me know. Okay, some general items. When you are planning your meetings, you probably want to take a look at the Capitol Complex. This is a website you can go to. You could also just Google Capitol map. One thing that you'll notice right away is that the House and the Senate are on different sides of the Capitol. It takes probably 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, depending on how fast you walk to get from one side to the other. So you really don't want to be going back and forth a lot. The other thing you'll notice is that all of the buildings are connected underground, which is important, one, because it's easier to go underground than to go outside, but also because if you go underground, you don't have to go through security again. So look at that on the map, but also if you're in a meeting and you have questions about, well, how do I get to the next meeting underground, just ask whoever you're meeting with, and they'll typically be able to give you directions. Getting to the Hill, taxi and then metro are probably the easiest ways to get to and from the Hill. If you're driving, I would recommend parking at Union Station. It's on the Senate side, so it's a little ways from the House side, but you can always, just about always find parking there, and it's pretty easy in and out. I just got a note, can you send out which senators belong to the Fire Caucus? So I can send that out, and I think this was from Joel. So Joel, I can certainly follow up with you regarding Nebraska senators who are in the Fire Caucus. But for anybody else who's interested, if you go to cfsi.org, they have an up-to-date list of all representatives and senators who are in the Fire Caucus. Fire Caucus is essentially a group of members of Congress who, generally speaking, support the fire service. And it's one of the larger caucuses in the Congress. And if your representative or senators are not in the caucus, it's always a good idea to ask them to join. It doesn't commit them to any particular positions, but just sort of puts them into a group of senators who are expressing their support for the fire service. And it also puts them on a mailing list that the Fire Caucus co-chairs will often use to say, hey, this is an issue that we all support and we'd like you to support as well. I mentioned earlier that you should be taking notes in your meetings. If there's anything that comes up in your meeting that you want me to follow up on, make a note of it and let me know, because I'm more than happy to say, hey, talk to the staffer about this issue. give him or her a call, and I'm happy to do that after meetings. Please print and bring your own copies of one-pagers. This is more for NVFC board, but I suppose anyone who is going up to the Hill and would like NVFC one-pagers, I will be sending those out to the board, probably send drafts in March and then send final versions in April. I like to finalize those as close to the meeting as possible because the issues really do change from day to day and week to week. Anybody who's on this call who would like copies of the one-pagers, let me know, and I'm happy to share them. I probably will be emailing them just to the board, but they aren't top secret or anything, so I'm more than happy to share them with any NVFC member who's interested. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation. Thank you for participating. There's my contact information as promised. That's my direct line, so if you call that, you'll actually get to my desk, and obviously my email. If anybody has questions at this point, please raise your hand or type them. I'll pause here for a little bit, and if I don't see anything, then we can just go ahead and end. Okay. Well, I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to stop here. Thanks again for participating. We will be posting a recording of this somewhere on our website, so if you want a copy, let me know, and I'm happy to share that with you. Thanks very much.